Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Peter. I want to begin by thanking him and the organizers for inviting me, I think, and for organizing this wonderful conference that has really made me think a lot about certain aspects of the judicial role that we don't think about on a daily basis. I also want to emphasize just at the outset that I'm speaking, of course, today personally. I'm not in any way speaking for my colleagues or for the institution. So these are basically my own reflections, which I hope you will have questions about after, and we can have a discussion. Now, when Peter called me a number of months ago and asked me, explain this exciting conference, and asked me to talk about the judicial role in citizenship, my first reaction was, what can I, as a judge, possibly have to say about engaging citizens? I'm by definition not supposed to descend from the dais and into the fray. I'm supposed to be aloof and detached in that sort of ivory tower of the bench. And I'm not sure it would even be appropriate for me to talk about that. But of course, Peter doesn't give up easily. And in his usual persuasive way, I found myself getting off the phone, having been convinced that I might actually have something to say. After I seem to recall there was one good half-hour discussion in which various ideas started to come to mind about how the judiciary, how an engaged citizenship both experiences justice in a meaningful way and can reinforce the values of citizenship. So I have to credit Peter with the title for the talk. I don't think I could possibly have come up with anything so erudite, but that is what translated into the title of the talk, Transformative Encounters with an Independent Judiciary. Now, right at the outset, I also want to thank my law clerk, Liam Harris, who has helped me tremendously and will also be called into action to help me meet the strict publishing deadline of 2 weeks from now, which I might mention kind of got slipped in there. I think when I agreed to do this, I wasn't completely conscious of the fact that I had to have a publishable chapter in a book ready 2 weeks after today. But be that as it may, as I say, Peter's a very persuasive fellow. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. So I'm going to structure my remarks today and the paper that I develop into 4 general topics. The first is the independence of the judiciary, because that is a fundamental premise of having meaningful citizenship and having an engaged citizenship. I'm not going to say too much about that because Asher is going to talk about the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. But I'll say a couple of things about it in a minute. The second is the ways in which citizens experience the judiciary. They're engaged with it. And by this, the players, the litigants, witnesses, and juries. And I'll say more about that in a minute. And then citizen engagement outside the judiciary, by which I mean various initiatives to try to get citizens engaged and interested in the judiciary and the judicial system. And probably the most recent and vivid example of this is the Supreme Court sitting in Winnipeg recently, and I'll say a couple more things about that. And then the final thing I want to end with, that I think is a good place to end because it can provide some opportunity for some discussion, is the potential tension that can arise between the ideal, the merit in having citizen engagement with the judiciary on one hand, and the need for judges to remain impartial and independent. and whether and to what extent is it that as judges and the courts look more accessible to the members of the public, that there is, and to what extent is there a risk that the perception of impartiality and independence of the institution will be undermined. And there are no right answers to that question at this point. In my view, it's just something we need to think about. As we know, and as I'm sure you've been hearing throughout this conference, and from the title, constitutional democracy is under stress around the world. Alienation and a lack of understanding of what judicial independence is and what it means for the role of judges is widespread. We hear the President of the United States regularly criticizing the courts and individual judges for their decisions, and not just saying that decision was wrong in law, but personally criticizing judges and players in the legal system. In England, the birthplace of our common law system, the foundations of democracy have been rocked since the Brexit referendum in 2016. And one of the symptoms of this is the alienation of citizens and deep schisms between, in England, deep schisms between the Remain and the Leave sides. When the question of Parliament was required to ratify the referendum arose in 2016, the Miller case, the first Gina Miller case, went to the UK Divisional Court. When the court decided, the Divisional Court decided that the issue did have to go to Parliament, the response of the tabloid press was strong, as illustrated by the following headline. This was in the Daily Mail, as you can see. I found this to be a powerful and jarring image. The schism between the Remain and the Leave remains, and the sense of alienation and disenfranchisement of many citizens is fueled further in this day and age by the false facts discourse, which in turn, in the days of social media and the erosion of the economic viability of the traditional press, is a factor that complicates and renders more serious and pervasive the schisms that we see. I would just add on the subject of England, the schisms have been exacerbated by the recent Supreme Court decision in the UK. I was watching BBC coverage of the decision a week ago, and some people think the decision is wonderful, and other people think that the judges are legislating and they have no business doing this. And of course, it's very much, those views are very much aligned with the Leave camp and the pro-Boris Johnson camp, and the Remain, and so on. And so we have schisms which are very deep and don't seem to be very amenable to discussion, compromise, and so on. Now, as Canadians, I think we can be pretty smug, even sometimes, dare I say it, a little self-righteous, thinking that we're somehow immune to the rise of populism and constitutional crises of the sort that we're seeing elsewhere. In my view, we shouldn't be. Constitutional democracy is always a work in process. It is an iterative and dynamic process, and it depends, among other things, on citizen engagement and investment. Now I'll turn to my next slide. So I'm not going to say, as I said, very much about the independence of the judiciary, except to say that, of course, it is a very, very important aspect of the rule of law, and all political players, the principle that all political players are subject to the same rules. The system has to be, though, independent from control by individual citizens. That is a very important principle. And on this, by the same token, however, it has to be respected. In order to have legitimacy, it has to have a certain degree of respect, and the perception of independence and impartiality is critical to the legitimacy of the judiciary and that aspect of the rule of law. So it's very important, and that's another aspect of the need to foster engagement, appropriate engagement by judges and by citizens in the justice system. Citizens should understand what the judiciary, what the judicial system is about, and feel that they have a stake in the independent and impartial administration of justice. So I come back to the first question I asked Peter. How can judges properly, or how can the judiciary, both as an institution and individually, foster meaningful engagement? How does it happen? How can it happen? How should it happen? And that led me to think about three ways, and I'm really only don't only have time to talk about one of them. But obviously, the citizen as litigant, there are many, many forms that this takes. It can be public interest litigant, it can be the litigant as an accused person criminally, a litigant in a civil lawsuit. Many, not all, but many of these are reluctant participants in the legal system. The citizen as witness. Similarly, I know that the judges in the room will all know, and lawyers in the room will all know, that witnesses are very often not really thrilled to have to be there, and they're particularly not thrilled after they have the experience of being cross-examined and their very reliability and credibility challenged. But there you go. But I really want to focus on the citizen as juror, partly because that was the first real example that I thought about when I spoke to Peter and that I started sort of developing. So I knew from the first time I went into a crowded courtroom to choose a jury that the vast majority of potential jurors were desperate to figure out a way of getting out of it. I knew this because as a new judge, I once slipped into a courtroom to watch one of my most seasoned criminal colleagues choose a jury. All of the people around me assumed that I was there to be possibly selected as a jury, and they're all saying, "What's your excuse? What's your excuse?" and so on. Now, the thing is, just to let you know, if you're ever in that position, we're on to you. And despite all this, jurors are eventually chosen. The process can be complex, and it can take from a matter of hours to days. After they are chosen, they are sworn and affirmed, sworn or affirmed. And then they are put in the hands of the jury. And the registrar says the following words. This means that what is happening is this is the moment in which it is made the jury's responsibility to decide the guilt or innocence of this person. And the registrar reads out the following words. Members of the jury, look upon the accused and hearken to his charge. Upon this, the charge is read out. Upon this indictment he hath been arraigned. Upon his arraignment he hath pled not guilty. And for his trial he hath put himself upon his country, which country you are. Now, I found these words very moving, always, and I would often find myself a little bit teary when I heard them being read out. But what the significance of it is that from about this moment on, practically invariably, all these people who an hour or so before had been thinking of, how am I going to get out of this, were kind of riveted with the recognition that this was a really serious matter. They'd been sworn, and the vast majority of sworn or pledged to do their best and to decide the case upon the evidence in front of them. And I was just tremendously impressed over my years as a trial judge with how seriously jurors took it. It is a transformative experience for them. I would always go out into the I would always go and talk to the jury afterwards to see, to just thank them, because it's actually very tough work, particularly in a long trial, and jurors do make a lot of sacrifices. So I made a point of going and thanking them, and I would always invite them to ask questions about the process. Of course, you couldn't discuss, and we didn't ever discuss, the deliberations or anything like that, but one of the comments they would always say was, I didn't want to do this, but it was one of the most important things I've ever done as a citizen, and I wish everybody could have the chance to do this. And it was a very profound experience for me over the years to see that. So, of course, for most citizens, don't have much opportunity to engage in the courtroom. And most citizens feel generally that's a good thing, and in some ways it is. But there is a broader aspect to this, to the notion of engagement and citizen engagement. And I want to talk about that now, and that's what I mean by citizen engagement outside the judiciary. First, and I'm talking open courts. This is something you hear a lot about. Citizen engagement requires the proceedings to be open. And the open court principle is entrenched in our Constitution and in our law. And the public is in principle entitled to come, more than in principle, entitled to come and see the work that we do. There are exceptions, but they're fairly rare exceptions, and they're quite circumscribed exceptions. We don't have a chance to talk about them today. But there's growing recognition that being a truly open judiciary means a lot more than allowing the public physical access to courtrooms. Courts have begun to recognize this and have made a huge effort in recent years to open the courts to a greater degree. Now, most Supreme Court of Canada appeals are live streamed and later televised, and increasingly the courts of appeal across the country are doing this. I sat on one a few months ago that was live streamed as well. You know, I'm not sure it's competing with the latest Hollywood blockbusters, but the point is anybody who is interested has access to these. It's a very important principle. Efforts are also being made, and this is another very important aspect of accessibility, to ensure that the decisions, that the judgments that courts make, that judges make, are accessible and clearly communicated. Now, for any of you who've tried to understand legalese, using one of the most difficult examples, a provision of the Tax Act, for example, it can be very difficult. There's a long tradition of legal decisions that are not easy to read. Well, I'm happy to tell you that there's been a movement afoot for a number of decades now, which I think has made a big difference, that judges and young lawyers are very much encouraged and given writing courses to use plain language as much as possible. The Supreme Court of Canada and the UK Supreme Court as well have started, if you look on their websites, you will see very brief summaries of cases that have recently decided that are designed, they're shorter than a page, they're designed to summarize what the issues at stake and the decision of the court has been in terms that people can understand who don't have law degrees and are not law professors or lawyers or judges. There are also the Ontario Justice Education Network, for example, has educational programs. Every day of the week, practically, high school students are brought into the Superior Court, and judges take turns, and Crowns and defense lawyers take turns speaking to the students and explaining to them who the various players are in a courtroom and how the system works. You can see the interest in the eyes of these young people as they see a courtroom. And then they're also taken into a number of cases, real courtrooms where there are real cases going on, to see things in action. I'd also point out, though, that the decisions produced by judges, the media has been and continues to be a proxy for the average citizen going into court, because obviously we're not all in a position to take time out of our jobs and lives to go and sit in in courtrooms. And so the media has, for many long time honored tradition, that the media has reported on and attended courts to be able to relate this information to the public. This then makes the current threat that traditional media is under. When I say traditional media, I mean sort of non-tabloid media is under threat with the false facts doctrine and the internet and the growing reality that people realize that you can't believe everything that you see online. And it's very difficult. It can be very difficult for the ordinary citizen to tell the difference between a report in the tabloid press and a report in a carefully researched a report of a legal event or a court decision. The Twitter phenomenon, the social media phenomenon, has really made this even more challenging. So just also on another subject of the engagement, judges as individuals. So judges in their individual capacities have also shown increasing willingness to engage with the public, and we're encouraged to do this. We're encouraged by the bar, we're encouraged by our courts, and just again to use the example of the Supreme Court judges last week in Winnipeg. I was there, obviously not as a Supreme Court judge, but I was there for an appellate conference at the same time, and the city went wild. And the Maclean's magazine headline that was published on Friday, the headline reads, "Supreme Court Justices Come to Winnipeg, and the Crowd Goes Wild." And the cover story has the Chief Justice dropping the puck at the pretrial, I think it was the last pretrial game of the Winnipeg Jets. And they had, I will say, a very, very busy week in Winnipeg. You know, they were individually dispatched to high schools, to the law school to talk to law students, and there are very few places that they weren't. So this, in my view, is a recognition and a positive sign, a recognition that we have to see public engagement as an important value, public engagement in the judiciary as an important value and as a positive value. But speaking very personally, it is deceptively simple to think that an unbridled push for more transparency and more engagement and more interaction in this context will always be positive when it comes to the judiciary. It is more complicated than that, and I think we need to confront the tension and think about the tension that this can bring to the institutional role of judges as not only having to be impartial and independent, but necessarily being seen to be impartial and independent. As a judiciary, as an institution, becomes more accessible in all senses, and I haven't spoken about financial accessibility. Obviously, that is a huge and critically important issue for the judiciary. But as judges become more accessible in the ways that I've spoken about it, gray areas begin to emerge. There's a delicate balance to be struck in order to maintain our independence, which, as I have said, is central to democracy. The more judges engage directly with society, the greater the risk that they're seen as being a little off the pedestal, that they're seen for who they are as people, as fellow citizens, formed by our own backgrounds and experiences and holding our own beliefs. So far, that sounds like a pretty good thing. But the fact that judges are people can be inconvenient in terms of our independence, and more importantly, in terms our independence, but more importantly, in terms of the perception and the public perception of our independence and impartiality. It's not enough, as I say, and I must emphasize, for us to be impartial and independent in the decisions that we render from the bench. We have to be seen and understood individually and institutionally as impartial and independent. This becomes more and more difficult as the veil of mystery and ritual in which the judiciary has historically been cloaked wears thin. I was thinking last night, as I was thinking about these remarks, of that wonderful scene in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy and her three friends go and finally think they're going to see the wizard, and they pull the curtain away. She pulls the curtain away, having gotten a little bit suspicious because Dorothy was very smart. She pulls the curtain away, and there's this little man who turns out to be very human, but not a wizard at all. Anyway, simply put, engagement is sometimes at tension with the independence and the manner in which we pursue greater engagement. This issue, therefore, deserves thoughtful reflection. So I'm going to end by saying I don't have answers. I have questions, and there are many. Should judges volunteer to be coaches of local softball leagues, or judges at the annual Pooch Pool Party in support of their rural community, or serve on church committees, synagogue or mosque committees? These are small examples of roles that give judges and citizens the opportunity to experience judges and other citizens together. It's arguably important because it's very hard to vilify an institution when its members have a face. But there may be a risk, and this is the question I pose, that as we become more visible as individuals and institutions, we risk compromising the perception of integrity and respect that are essential elements of a healthy democracy, constitutional democracy. This is made more complex by the existence of differences of opinion within the judiciary on how we should answer these questions, and indeed how we should approach the questions at all. And I would just mention as a recent example that is in the public domain, the example of Justice Patrick Smith, who was recently, a few years ago, had been appointed as the interim dean at Lakehead University to fill a vacancy that was left by the fairly sudden resignation of the dean. He was found to have contravened the Judges Act by taking the post and was disciplined, though not removed, by the Judicial Council. And this has given rise to a great deal of controversy within the legal community, and is an illustration of the tension that can arise. And my question is, how are we going to navigate these waters? And how are we going to think about it? And I would just close by saying that question, like all difficult questions of democracy, citizenship, engagement, and the preservation of a constitutional democracy, are complicated, iterative, dynamic works in progress. Thank you.